how is it that political leaders can bring evidence, information, and resolve into leading on this debate? The previous panel ended by saying that governments need clear, simple rules for the private sector, better integrated planning to price externalities and to ensure that prices are honest. That's a good shopping list. It's a tough one, and you can ask, well, why haven't governments delivered on that? And that's what this panel is now about. And we've got some wonderful panelists to help us answer that. And I'd just like to say a word about our panelists before we begin. So the person I'm going to turn to first with a tough question, and he's looking away because he knows that, is David Milliband. David Milliband was was Foreign Secretary for the United Kingdom. Prior to that, he was Secretary of State for the Environment, and I think led what was probably the first legally binding emissions reduction regime in the world. He served as Minister for Schools in a number of different policy positions, and he will be able to talk through both the challenges and opportunities that he has lived through in the British political system. To my right is Professor Qi, who's a professor of energy policy at Tsinghua University, having studied and taught in the United States at Berkeley and other places. Professor Qi is the principal investigator and editor of China's annual review of low carbon development. And we're looking forward to learning from the results of that research and your understanding of the way that China is leading on these policies. Rachel Kyte, next along on the panel, is Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank. So she brings to this conversation an experience not only of working with 187 countries on these issues, but also a prior experience in the World Conservation Union and as somebody who has founded and led NGOs working in this area. And then finally, we are enormously privileged to have Governor Yi here with us. Governor Yi is the governor of the State Administration of Foreign Exchange in China. An investor in the room was explaining to me the travails and burdens of working out how to invest a portfolio of about $500 million last night. Governor Yi, of course, is in charge of investing many times that amount on behalf of the people of China. And so the long-term planning issues involved with that are foremost in his head. He's also a very accomplished scholar, a published economist, and we're very pleased that you could join us this morning, Governor Yi. So let's get to the substance of this morning. I think one of the things that I hear most regularly speaking around the world about the School of Government is the question, why do democracies always fail? Should we give up on democracy? Because democracy seems never to be able to deliver the intelligent, long-term policy. That's quite a challenge for a school of government. It was put to me in Latin America as, why don't you make your school a school of benign dictatorship? I'm not sure that's where this panel is going to take us this morning, but perhaps it is. David Milliband, do democracies fail to do long-term planning? Can they? Could you give us examples of where it is that politicians can be long-term?
Well, thanks very much. I think the truth is that in the 20th century, the democracies were far-sighted, they were innovative, and they were far more successful than the autocracies. And that applies not just in economic realms, but actually in environmental and other realms as well. So I think that you have to beware the tyranny of the current, and certainly beware the tyranny of viewing all democratic practice through the current situation of governance gridlock, frenetic gridlock in the US. I think the truth about the topic we're discussing today is that neither democracies nor autocracies have proved themselves terribly successful in addressing the long-term sustainability challenges for a very obvious reason. The costs of the agenda that we've been discussing for the last 24 hours are upfront, they are visible, and they hit you, whereas the benefits are invisible, long-term, and may be of benefit to somebody else. So actually, you'd expect governments to shortchange the kind of agenda that we've been discussing. I think what that tells us is something very, very important, that rational choice analysis, which has infected political science to a very dangerous degree in many political science departments around the world, shouldn't infect a discussion of politics. Because actually, the biggest constraint, in my view, on politicians, whatever political system they're in embracing the kind of agenda that the business people put forward on this panel just in the last hour, the biggest constraint actually is not fear of voters. I don't really believe that. The biggest constraint is actually a more serious one, which is that a lot of politicians don't believe the assumptions that have held together many people here over the last 24 hours. A lot of politicians don't believe the science. A lot of politicians don't believe the consequences. A lot of politicians don't believe the arguments about first runner advantage, about resource efficiency delivering shareholder value. And I think we've got a very fundamental argument to take on before we come to the conclusion that it's actually the voters that are the biggest blockage in this area.
Sorry, David, could I just follow up? Do you think they don't believe the costs, or do you think they don't believe the solutions? Which bit do they not believe? More
of them don't believe the solutions than don't believe the costs, but some of them don't believe either. And I think that there are some, I mean, if you think about it, the counterposition, which are the areas where you've seen major breakthrough? And in my own experience, it was a time of prosperity. It was a time of political competition when our political opponents wanted to use the environmental agenda to detoxify themselves. It was a time of mass mobilization among people in the UK. That led to this legislation that binds every future government in the UK until 2050 to reduce our overall carbon emissions by 80%. That is the law of the land. It's as powerful as the public sector borrowing requirement to have the net environmental borrowing requirement. But it was produced by a particular set of conditions. I thought that the contribution from the CEO of Puma was very, very important as he talked through the relationship between German business and German government about how you've developed your social partnership, economic partnership, to see the economic win. I'm sure the governor will talk about the really significant change since the 10th five-year plan in China, where there is now a much more mature debate in China, a very urgent debate in China about the immediate costs it faces. So I think it's, I mean, I guess what I said to you beforehand and what I put on the table, unless the moral imperative is strong enough, then none of this is going to work. You've got to have politicians who believe that there is a moral imperative in this. Because in the end, for all the books about leadership, what counts in politics is actually passion more than anything else. If the voters see that you've got a passion for something, that is the entry ticket to an authentic political conversation. And I think that there's a danger in the exam question that you've posed that we fall into the trap of thinking that politicians are more prisoner of their focus groups than they are. In my experience, they're more a prisoner of the limitations of their own views. And I think that's where we've got some serious work to do.
Governor Yi, David Milliband, mentioned, China's approach. But if we just pick up on this issue, looking at China, do politicians believe that this is a very urgent issue? And do they believe that they know what to do about it?
Yes. The short answer is yes.
Is that yes to both?
For sure, yes. You see, each country have their own decision-making process for the very big, important event. Whereas the decision-making process is different among countries across the world. But I think our thinking on this issue is very important and very urgent in China. I personally participated in the drafting of the 10th, 11th, and the 12th five-year plan in the past 15 years. I remember that since our 9th five-year plan, we already have some content in it. So that in the 10th, 11th, and 12th, mostly in 12th, if you read the 12th five-year plan in China, so it has been very clear about the climate change, energy efficiency, and also we use the word energy efficiency and environmentally friendly economy. We want to build that. And also there are concrete measures and also agendas. I think that is at the country level. And then we have the world level, like we jointly decide on something. And we have UNFCCC, and also we have Kyoto Protocol, and then we have Bali roadmap, we have Copenhagen Accord, and as well as the Durban conference. You see, once country made a decision and made clear policy, and then it comes to international forum, then we jointly world as a whole, jointly to make a decision and to make a consensus. And if we can make a clear roadmap and a decision in the global forum, and then it coming back to each country, it's up to each country to implement the decision we have been made so far. I think if we can follow that sequence, we can for sure have a very clear roadmap and also feasible policies that can be implemented for each country.
Thank you, Governor. Can I come to you, Rachel? Because the Governor has taken us into the international negotiation. A lot of the developing country members that the World Bank is working with, they do accept that this is an urgent problem, but they come to the international debate saying, why should our people, who are the least able in the world to pay for mitigation solutions, why should they bear that burden? Some of them say, wealthy countries are promising us that they will pay if we do, but our experience is that sometimes they promise, but they don't actually pay. And so their third argument is, therefore, we will wait until the industrialized country polluters do show leadership. We'll wait till they do something because they're the elephants that need to do something first. So how does that look from where you sit with the developing countries you're working with?
Well, I think that's true if you sit in a negotiating room in the United Nations or in one of these large treaty body conversations. But I actually think there's two things going on in the world. There is a rhetorical stance that needs to be maintained. There is real anger and resentment behind that policy stance. But quite frankly, when you get down into the country level, then countries are trying to reinvent a way out of the situation they find themselves in. For most developing countries, they understand that we're not only at an era where we need to find a different kind of growth path, that they can't necessarily afford to grow dirty and then clean up. It's the final myth-busting of the Kuznets curve. But they're also very well aware that they're facing an age where overseas development assistance is only going to be a scintilla of what they need in order to provide jobs for their growing populations, to be competitive in a flat, multi-speed, multipolar world. And they're interested in redesigning a future that nobody else has really lived. So, they're frankly not looking to the United States or to Europe for their examples. I mean, they want to learn from the countries which are one generation away from absolute poverty. So they want to know how Korea has done it, how Mexico's doing it, how Brazil is doing it. And I think they also are open to the idea that they need to grow green, but they want to be able to do it inclusively because they really want to find out how do they take the innovations which have been manifold in the last decade around how to build a new form of safety net and how to grow green as well, how to protect natural resources. They're really looking for help on bringing those two together Because if they don't provide jobs and if they don't provide livelihoods and a way forward for their populations, increasingly young populations, then yes, we can talk about changing bad subsidies and putting good incentives into the economy, but they've got to be able to do both at the same time. And I think there's a real challenge for us because we've put a number on fossil fuel subsidies, right? We said $400 billion of bad subsidies a year don't work for the environment, don't work for the poor. It's very hard to explain to the poor that fossil fuel subsidy is bad for them. They think it's good for them. And so you can make the policy articulation, if you've got leadership and if you've got the cabinet agreement, you can say, okay, we're going to phase out the fossil fuel subsidy. But you need the massive marketing, political engagement effort that persuades the poor that this is actually in their own interest. Because without that, look at Nigeria earlier this year, it doesn't work. And so you've got to, the poor have got to be with you, otherwise you're not going to get the sort of green future that you want. But I think countries are having two conversations. They have a political stance in the negotiations, but at home they are inventing a future which is totally different from the one that, it's not a continuum of the line that we've drawn over the last 50 years.
So, Rachel, you said look at Nigeria last year. Can you just give the audience a glimpse of what happened in Nigeria last year?
Yeah, so a well thought out understanding of the fact that fossil fuel subsidies were crippling the economy, and perhaps a not so well executed introduction of a change in subsidy regime, which resulted in people moving onto the streets, protesting violence, because obviously it's a difficult governance situation, but obviously a strong feeling from the constituency that would benefit, that the case had not been made for them to understand how they would benefit.
And in hindsight, what would you learn from that? Was it the wrong priority to go first on, or what's the lesson from that?
Probably not the wrong a priority, but what do you have to do in order to be able to set it up to succeed? The public engagement, the understanding, the evidence, the marketing, the reaching out, the telling of stories through all kinds of multimedia, so that people understand that actually I'm going to benefit from this and I'll benefit immediately. So yeah, we've taken we weren't involved necessarily in the actual instrumentation of that, but one of the questions we're asking ourselves is that if we've been so successful in helping so many other countries sort of completely change their trade regime, I don't think that there's a country that we've successfully helped change their fuel subsidy regime. And if we're serious about inclusive green growth in the next few years, we're going to have to learn together with our clients on how to do that better.
Professor Qi, that example highlights this trade-off that countries have to make about where they are investing. And how does this look in China? In other words, is there a debate between investments in housing, in welfare and equality issues versus low carbon development, which is what you've been reviewing each year?
Well, I think what happened in that particular example in Nigeria, you can, of course, China is very different, but you can see this kind of a conflict considering domestic challenges and also the international agenda, such as energy and climate change. I think that kind of balance and the thinking is all you can also see in China. What happened in China, like what Governor Yi just talked about in the 11th five-year plan, and currently the 12th five-year plan, you see these elements on addressing the climate change issue, addressing the energy security, renewable energy efficiency issues related to low carbon development. A lot of this has to do with the domestic considerations, because China now facing the challenges, environmental degradation. This is just massive environmental degradation and the resource inefficiency problems. In 2007, and President Hu Jintao made it very clear, and he summarized for the last 30 years, the biggest achievement is the rapid economic development, and the biggest problem he put there is this huge cost in environment and natural resources. I think that was just a response to the domestic challenges. And in that sense, China and many other developing countries, they didn't wait. They didn't wait for developed countries to move first, because that is the domestic concerns and challenges you have to address immediately. And on the other hand, this international pressure did play a very important role in both raising the awareness and make sense for the urgency of these issues. So you can see in China before 2007, before the fourth assessment report by IPCC, and after that, that was basically is a very interesting divide. After that, the awareness level in both the government and the general society it has been really booming, and people realize this is a very important issue to take. And since that, you can see the actions in the government, in the business, in the civil society, that has been really changed the whole landscape now. So I want to go back to that whether or not you see all this is working, whether or not the government is working. One way to look at this, whether or not to answer this question is to look at, not to give a general answer to this overly generalized question. Rather, it is more helpful to look at whether or not the policies are effective in addressing these issues. When you look using that kind of a criterion, you see the Chinese policy was very effective in achieving the target set by the government. For instance, 20% of cut the energy intensity during the period from 2006 to 2010, and China was able to achieve 19.1% of cut in energy intensity. Translating that into numerical terms, that is more than 1.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide saving. But that is 5 times than the entire EU under Kyoto Protocol. And also, if you look at the renewable energy sector, if you look at the reforestation, I mean, this is really working. On the other hand, though, if we change the view angle, you see during the same period of time, the total emission has become the #1 in the world, right? Also, the total energy consumption became the #1 in the world in the same period of time. And during that period of time, the total emission increased by more than a third. And the gap by the end of that period, the gap between China and the United States is 22%, the Chinese emission. So then you may say, well, probably this particular success is a greater failure in a broader context. What the point I'm trying to make is, there are multiple facets of this kind of problems, domestic dimensions, international dimensions, and there is no clear answer, a generalized clear answer to a generalized question.
So a lot of people looking from the outside world in imagine that these environmental measures in China are very top-down, that it's the government that understands the problem and it's the government that's providing the solution. They might look at the United States and see it the opposite way. But just focusing on China, is that the way it is, or are you seeing more and more firms, people, organizations, communities picking up and thinking about these issues and acting on them?
Well, I see that is a useful characterization, but I also see that is also an overly generalized statement. In China, it is true, there's a top-down national mandates, and this what we call it the responsibility, the energy saving responsibility system. You see that is definitely playing a very major role. On the other hand, though, this bottom-up approaches, there are more than 120 cities and provinces that are engaged in this low carbon development. And right now in the first phase, there are 5 provinces, 8 cities were allocated as national pilots to push for this low carbon development. And there are many more of them. They're coming to the national government, to National Development and Reform Commission, and they want to be part of that. And you see there are a lot of community initiatives right now, so which are very exciting. So what I see is you see these forces from both from different sectors and from both directions. Right?
Thank you.
Right.
Rachel, positive examples. I'm going to come to each of you 3 panelists before opening up to the audience. But where would you tell people to look for positive examples of government action? You mentioned Brazil earlier before the panel, but is that an example that could you give us 1 or 2? They can be small examples, but small examples of where governments really are taking action.
Yeah, so I think Brazil's done a number of things which are very positive. One is on the social side, the Bolsa Familiar, which they're now turning into a Bolsa Verde. So basically you are paying communities to behave in a responsible manner related to the environment. So you're knitting a social safety net with environmental behaviours. I think that's fundamental. The Amazon Fund also, finding ways to bring resources into indigenous communities so that they can maintain a livelihood and still continue to live with the resources, and you get the carbon emission benefit from maintaining the forest. I think there are public policy successes in Mexico's effort around energy efficiency. I think if it's continued to be carried through with the new government, is changing things quite profoundly. I think Professor Qi made a very important point, which is that one of the most exciting units of accounts is actually sub-sovereign, is actually at the provincial and city level. And I think where we get sometimes more excited is working with mayors around the world. I mean, Mayor Bloomberg is outstanding and shows what can happen, and he's knitted together with President Clinton and others at the C40. Beyond the C40, we've got mayors from Dar es Salaam, from the suburbs of Jakarta, through to cities across Latin America trying to get methane out of landfill. What is the one thing a mayor worries about when they wake up on Monday morning? Waste. Okay, so let's attack waste. So I think that there are all kinds of really positive things going on, and that's what people want to know and need to know. They're like, okay, so we understand we have to fundamentally shift the growth path, but where do I start? And what we're trying to show is that everybody has got somewhere where they can start tomorrow. No matter if you're a post-conflict country or a low-income country or a middle-income country or a high-income country, there is something that you can attack tomorrow. Now, I think back to David's original point is, if you're going to build a long-term piece of infrastructure, if you're going to change your landfill, if you're going to build green infrastructure, if you're going to change the infrastructure in a city, then that's going to be, the mayoral terms of 4 mayors, 12 years. It's going to see 5 or 6 ministers of planning come and go. And just the tenor of the lending and the tenor of the structure of the deal mean it's very difficult from a political economic point of view. And we've got to be able to find ways to sustain that vision through successive ministers, through successive mayors. But we're beginning to start to see that.
One sentence. Right, just one sentence. I personally involved in helping a lot of city governments in design the low carbon development plan. And when you introduce the C40 program, the Clinton Foundation, and there's many of them get very excited and very inspired. And then later, when they learn those are the largest cities in the world, and these cities become quite disappointed because they feel like they are too small to participate in that. But the point is, there are a huge enthusiasm from the local levels. Right?
Great.
Right.
David, we're in an environment where governments, including the one in this country, are cutting budgets vigorously and viciously. And that's leading some governments to say, look, yes, we should be green, but we can't afford it during the crisis. We'll wait till we're in a period of growth. What's one thing they could be doing, even in this environment?
Well, the biggest thing that any government can do is obviously to put a price on carbon. I mean, that's just, if you want to make a market, you've got to put a price on something. And I was slightly surprised that the 4 business leaders, when they were asked at the end of the last session, what's the one thing a government could do, they all focused on the reporting and monitoring, which obviously is important, but it felt to me like a second or third best answer, and they were almost giving up on the market making and the market pricing. The biggest thing a government can do is put a price on carbon. There are also, it should be said, striking examples of regulation that has driven out the most polluting, the most dangerous, the most resource-intensive practices. And I think that the Scandinavian countries, Germany, are important in that. I think it's very interesting to hear Rachel talk about Mexico and energy efficiency, because every International Energy Authority publication you've ever read will tell you that a third of the gain that needs to be made in sustainability is over energy efficiency. And actually, I think that the Mexican example is a very important one. Can I, though, just, before you go out to the wider audience, make the point that we've talked so far really about the national level or the local level, and the international level really matters. And what you have at the international level is either weak intervention, so the most advanced form of pricing is the European emissions trading system, but it's obviously 12, 13 euros a ton of emissions. It's pretty weak. Or you have gridlock, which is the way I would describe the current UNFCCC process, gridlocked in a blame game, which centers around where is the United States going to play a role and how is it going to play that role. Or you have misgovernance or ungovernance. One of the things that was mentioned yesterday is the state of the fisheries. I'm involved in the development of a Global Oceans Commission, and if you look at the high seas, there is a UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but the vesting of power in a series of vested interests is leading to overfishing on an absolutely monumental scale. So I think it's important when you're thinking about the national and local efforts that are being made, these national and local leaders are trying to run up an escalator that is actually going down. And that downward shift is coming from an international system that isn't configured properly for this kind of initiative. And I think that is, if we're being honest about the politics of this, you've got to see how the international relates to the national. And my own view is that while the bottom-up initiatives are incredibly important and probably going to lead to more change than the national level, the C40 that Rachel referred to, if you really want to get drive in this, then you're going to have to get a push from the international level.
Governor Yi, China, we all woke up this morning to hear on the news about China's slowing growth, and China has an ambitious program of green investment. But is that going to be affected by slowing growth?
I think given the growth is a little bit slowing down, I think that's the opportunity to have more investment. Actually, we are planning to do that. And among those very important investment projects, environmental protection, water treatment, and infrastructure, energy efficiency are on the top priority. I think now China is in action. And if you look at recent few years, the largest energy efficiency projects, environmental protection projects, including the environmental protection equipment, so on and so forth. China is an extremely large market. And I don't bring the number here, but if you look up the number and see how much environmental protection related investment happening around the world, China is among the largest. I think that kind of policy will continue. Government is very firm on this. And in this kind of process, also you see we have some concerns in terms of domestic politics and also domestic consensus building up process. For example, some media, Chinese scholar says that consider the historical emission that developed country has done a lot in the past hundreds of years. You see, China is a developing country. The rapid growth has only happened in the last 30 years, right? If you calculate the entire emission, and you see China is by far less. Also now, China is emission a lot. And the second concern is that they are afraid that this kind of policy will have a negative impact on growth. You see, that's a concern. The third concern is that you see, for the local government, they kind of watching each other. They always say that if my neighbor implement strictly, then I will do. If I implement it strictly first, then it increases my cost and slow down the growth in my jurisdiction. You see, that kind of concern, which is natural, but our policy, as far as the central government is concerned, and also as far as the policymaker, educator is concerned, we will try to do the following. First is education and communication to the general public. And we will consistently to tell the general public how important the environmental problem is. The sustainable growth pattern is crucial. And second, I think we will depend on technology innovation a lot, right? So that here, I would ask that you see, for developed countries, you have advanced equipment, advanced methodology, you can consider to export to China. China is a very large market. We would like to buy this kind of related equipment to do the efficient energy and also environmental protection treatment equipment. And the third very important aspect is improve our legal system, and especially on the law enforcement. You see, this kind of environmental protection, energy efficiency, we really do have a level of playing ground. And we have to implement the law rigorously. Otherwise, you would see that it's not equal for those who really follow the rule, and then their cost is higher, and then they suffer the cost without the benefit, right? So that China is a very large place. We realize that in this process, we really have to have a consistent law nationwide, and strengthening our law enforcement. And I think that's the direction to go. But of course, as complicated as this you can imagine, it's a process we will steadily and consistently pushing forward.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to you and to some questions from the audience, either to the panel as a whole or to individuals. David King.
This great panel has a question in front of it, and that is the economics of tomorrow. And I'm just going to rephrase that question in terms of the economics of the 20th century, which obviously served us very well in terms of the growth of human well-being. Is that still the right economics for the 21st century in a resource-constrained world? We heard yesterday, for example, from Peter Brabeck very graphically that water consumption is already beyond replaceable fresh water. And he even suggested that in China, this was going to be a major factor in China's continued growth. Are we going to have to reevaluate GDP growth as our single parameter for growth? Are we going to look at human well-being? What is the economics of tomorrow?
Thank you. So do we need a new economics? I'm going to take a couple of different questions, Anne-Marie.
Let me follow on Sir David's question with an idea from Herman Daly. If anyone had come into Parliament around 1750 and said, don't worry about the inability of most people to afford cloth because we haven't enough weavers, we're just going to make weavers 100 times more productive, nobody would have understood the concept, let alone thought it was possible. But we did that, and soon a Lancashire spinner could make the cloth that it required 200 weavers. But that was at a time when the relative scarcity of people was limiting progress and exploiting seemingly boundless nature. And now we have the opposite pattern of scarcity. We have abundant people and scarce nature. So part of the new economics should surely be to use resources 5, 10, 100 times more productively, wringing that much more work out of our energy, water, topsoil, minerals, everything we borrow from the planet. And for example, since materials flow, mass flow in the US economy is 99.98% pure waste, and it's not that much better in Europe, this must be one of the biggest business opportunities on the planet.
There's been a couple of audience members who are proficient with their eye touches, which is not a universally true thing. And they have asked us, who is going to lead? Can we wait for governments, or is it the private sector that's going to have to lead? A number of people have asked these questions. For example, on water conservation and allocation, will it again have to come from the private sector, or will we see government leadership? So I'd like to come back to the panel. You don't have to answer all the questions. Why don't you pick one each that is the one that's most provoked you? About whether we need a new economics, is that high on your agenda? We've had comments about the role that other groups have played. And then we've got these questions of who should lead? David Milliband suggested that the international process is important, but yesterday we heard Rio 20 described as a funeral process. So I worry that if we look to the international first, we're sort of paralyzing ourselves before we start. Answers, David.
If I may say so, I think to ask, is it government or is it business, is the wrong question, because it's obviously going to be both in different contexts at different levels. And for me, the sweet spot is very clear. It is government leadership, it is business innovation, and it is mass mobilization. And the truth of the answer to David King's question, should we have a different indicator than GDP? The truth is that that is going to be driven by the people, not by the governments. There's no point in a government telling people what they should value. What you're going to see is that as some of the scarcity that Amory Lovins referred to becomes a greater pinch on people's lives, it will go up as a factor that determines their actions. And so I think that you've got to recognize that those three actors have got to be aligned to get progress. The difficulty is when either in politics or in business, the relationship with the citizen or the consumer is blocked. And that can happen for reasons of corruption, it can happen for reasons of democratic blockage, or it can happen because the political process is bought out. The $1 one vote that Amory Lovins referred to. So I think if we end up looking to government or to business, we're going to get it wrong. The whole point is that this is a very dynamic area. The context is changing fast in different parts of the world. And I think that the discussion of American shale gas puts into very, very sharp perspective the narrative that we've told for some time, that the world is moving, if you like, simply into a world of resource scarcity rather than resource plenty. For the world's largest economy, more or less, for another 10 or 15 years, it's not going to feel like resource scarcity. And I think that's a very significant new factor. So my pitch would be that you've got to look at all three levels to make a difference.
By the way, another couple of questions that you've been throwing at us from your handsets. How do we get the United States to price carbon? How do we get China to stop building coal-fired power stations? A number of you have thrown those two questions. Feel free to pick them up, panelists, if you'd like to. Rachel, which question are you going to?
Well, I agree with David that I mean you're going to need both. I think what the private sector will innovate, first movers are emerging in every area. But what is really needed to go to speed and scale is a certain certainty around the regulatory environment. And that's the fear that the regulatory environment is going to change, and sort of guarantees against regulatory risk are increasingly something that long-term investors, especially those moving into more investment environments that are less familiar with, I think is going to be very important. But back to David's question about a new economics, I mean, as a non-economist, I don't know whether we need new economics, we need damn smarter economics than we've got at the moment. And there's, in putting environment in the production function and all of these sort of things are things that people have been talking about, and it's time to actually start doing it. I thought one of the interesting stories coming out of Rio was the sort of groundswell of support around actually starting to use natural capital accounting alongside GDP. 62 countries said we're going to start doing it, or we're already doing it, and we're going to start doing more of it or learn more about it. And the leadership there wasn't coming necessarily from the developed world, although the EU and the US joined in. That was coming from African countries for whom, if they take a 10, 15-year view of things, they need to be able to understand their natural wealth, because either they've got resource endowments that they've just discovered, or in the case of Botswana, they're beginning to look at the diminishing resource endowment of minerals, and they need to find out what the future is going to hold for them. And so I think, you know, that's something that we've been talking about for 40 years. 20 years ago, we said we were going to do. 19.5 years later, we actually get the UN to agree that there is a framework for doing it. And now it's simply a question of doing it. Now in the UK, they did it very well, and then it sort of bounced up against George Osborne's door, and it hasn't really gone into the Treasury yet. But then you've got the political economy of how do you have integrated decision making. The final thing I would say is there's a lot of fear about pollution haven, right, in today's economics, that somehow the price of environmental regulation is going to force industry overseas, force polluting industry elsewhere. All of the recent evidence is that actually, yes, environmental regulation is part of decision making by firms about where they will domicile and where they will locate, but it's a small part. And if polluting industries are moving, it's because of cheaper labour costs. That is the driver. And so I think that we need to really understand that you can afford to be fairly aggressive in environmental regulation without distorting your competitiveness. And so the proof of competitiveness and environmental performance needs to be refreshed a little bit in the public imagination, and there's a role for public dialogue around that.
Professor Qi.
Yeah, I would like to try if I can address the two questions from Professor King and Professor Lovins. I start with the easy one. Professor Lovins said if enter 1750 Parliament, I thought it's easy because we didn't have one in 1750. We didn't have a parliament over there, and we have one very powerful emperor. Certainly we didn't have the democracy, that whole system. But yet, then at that time, that is the time when, according to Professor Angus Madison, that is the time when the Chinese GDP is just about 1/3 of the entire world. And people, it's known to, it's said to have lived a good life back then. The point is, if we look at the situation then, it's just totally different challenges, as we see nowadays. Not to say back then it didn't take it took less than a century later than China lost the Opium War to the Great Britain. Speaking of the economics tomorrow, I think right now is really a great chance. In fact, if we look at the actions, not only by the government, but also by the business sector, taking the renewable energy sector, the investment, and during the 11th five-year plan, China on average put just about $50 billion US a year into this whole sector. And for the 12th five-year plan, from now until the year 2015, that is another $15 billion a year investment in this. Well, this, for one, will help to reduce the need for building the coal-fired power plant, but more is really building the competitiveness of the economy for the future. I think this is already taking place. This is, while the negotiators are still debating, arguing, and around the negotiation tables, these kind of things really is the thing we should look at. And this is what I agree with David. Both the business and the government and civil society need to take different kind of vision and different kind of passion leadership as well. Right?
And Governor Ye.
Hey, thank you. First, I think we should consider some economic measures or indicators rather than GDP. Right now in China, when we examine the local government officials' performance we already add, in addition to GDP, we add the air and the water pollution in their city or province as a very important indicator. If that is indicator is down, there's no good for this performance. Second, as far as the people-nature ratio has changed is concerned, Chinese people realize that China has 1.3 billion population. They cannot live a lifestyle like Americans, that they have to develop the most energy efficient lifestyle. Third, as far as the coal electricity generator is concerned, we get rid of a lot of small coal electricity generator each year in the past 5 years. And now you see we spend a lot of resources on sulfur scrubber and other most efficient equipment on the coal generators. And if you look at the electricity per unit of coal, now I think that indicator in China is very advanced, because a lot of new generator, very large generator, they are energy efficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if I can just then pull together some of what we've heard this morning before we end this panel. We started with this question of, why is the politics so difficult? If the solutions to most people in this room are so clear, why are the politics so difficult? I think David put it very eloquently in saying it's because the costs of doing something are very upfront and clear, particularly within an election cycle, and the benefits of doing something are much more long-term and diffused. And that's probably the answer to Dave King's question about why we need a new economics that actually takes those longer-term benefits and starts paying more attention to them in our economic modeling. But I think what the panel all agreed on is that politicians, whether of local communities or at the national or international level, need a confident belief in what the nature of the problem is. And they also need a confident belief in what the solution is, or to what extent the solution they're going to pay a political price for is going to have a real effect. And I think that's what this community of specialists really probably needs to keep stepping up to the plate to do, is to give political leaders that confidence, not just about what the problem is, but about the extent to which the solution you want them to take is going to bear fruit and have a serious positive legacy. And I think the third issue on the public-private, the previous panel highlighted these things that the private sector need to take action, which are all about governments giving them some certainty, some nice firm boundaries within which they can plan and invest. And I think that again pushes to this issue of politicians needing certainty so they can provide that certainty to the private sector. And finally, I think one of the really interesting takeaways for me in this panel comes from the examples that have been given of governments attempting change. The Brazilian case of going from the Bolsa Familiar, a welfare policy, to a Bolsa Verde, starting to do green welfare. The Nigerian case, where yes, it hasn't worked, but there's a lot of learning that can be done from that about the politics Nigeria will have to do. Those trying to bring about change will need to do at the grassroots level to make it work on the next run, and I'm sure they will. But perhaps, I think, almost most importantly of all, Governor, it was your comments about the challenges for China. I think it's too easy for governments in other places to say, well, it's easy for China, they can do it top down. When in fact, you've given us a very nuanced picture of why it's difficult, why one province will want competitive advantage vis-a-vis another province, why a mass public education campaign is important, and why, most of all, a rule of law that really makes the incentives the same for all communities in China is going to be essential for making China's strategy work. And I think it just highlights the extent to which we can and must all learn lessons from all countries about how to make the politics work. So thank you all very much for your participation in this panel, and I'm now going to turn back to our next panel. Thank you.